Thank you, Randy. Okay, I want to remind everyone the hashtag is midterm ed. I hope you're using it. And I also want you to all sort of think out your questions. I have a couple of my own right now, but then we'll open it up to you. So first, I want to start at the beginning, or at least early in things. And each of you has alluded to or specifically referenced sort of the role of youth in this election, and by proxy, the schools or their places of origin that are encouraging and supporting that. And I know that, Mike, you've written about sort of the need to reimagine and really rejigger high school if we go forward and craft an education system that works and gives all of our kids the best opportunities in life. And of course, Randy, you see students all around the country, and you've worked very closely with the students who are leading on the gun violence prevention movement. And Domingo, I think you see young people in your classroom every single day. So I'm curious to hear from each of you a little bit on the issue of engagement, the issue of what you're seeing, hearing, and feeling from students that feels different or new to this moment, or that doesn't, and what our responsibility is to engage more students in, to bring their voices into the process, to strengthen civil society and democratic participation. Anyone can jump in.
I guess I'll go first. Right. So I think this ties in neatly with some of the other comments that have been said already. I do think that at some level, this moment may provide an opportunity for people to come together to move forward an agenda, or as Randy was saying, come up with solutions. But I do think on a different level, and perhaps a much larger level, this is not a period, in my view, for solutions. At least that's not how I see it, and that's not how I see it with the students. And this is the reason why I'm saying this. I think this is a moment of disruption. Young people are energized to do something because they feel that the status quo on all levels has not produced the type of America that they think we should have. And in that energy, there is an opposition that is just as vigorous. Maybe may not have the numbers, but it's just as vigorous against that vision of America. And so the schools become a battleground. So as a professor in my classroom, I see the students with this type of energy, but as someone who studies school politics, I see this energy as well. And the wrong lesson, in my view, was to say, stop. Again, I come back to the Newark example. The reason why the city of Newark has local control of the schools is because the young people decided that enough was enough. Thousands of them walked out of school and shut down major highways in Newark. And it was that brought the powers that be to the bargaining table to say, okay, what is it that you guys want, right? And so I think that the wrong lesson here, and I'm for bringing people to the table and coming up with solutions, but just I don't know. My sense from the students and the young people is not that this is the moment for that, and so that's something to take into account, right? I think that there's going to be a lot more. And forgive me, my wife gets really nervous when I say this word, reckoning. There's a lot more reckoning that's going to be happening before we get to the place where long-term solutions are going to be viable. And I'm just saying that from my view in talking to people, young people, and the energy that is out there. So that's something to really take into account. So to your question about young people. And then the other thing that's associated with this, at some level, I agree with the assessment that there's not these big reforms, and so there's not a thirst for that. So that this may be a moment for, at the very least, for the type of the coming up together of folks across the table. But again, as somebody who studies state interventions and state takeovers of school districts, there's this energy in the South right now for that type of reform. Right, so New Orleans is a model for many folks, right? People have been celebrating the New Orleans model of increasing charter schools, the takeover essentially of the New Orleans schools, as Randy was just mentioning. That led to a 25% or more decrease in black teachers in New Orleans. the local community has been completely decimated from the decision-making process in New Orleans. And so, but people celebrate the 3 to 4% increase in graduation, arguably improved test scores and so forth. But they're looking at this in Jackson, Mississippi. They're looking at this in Jefferson County schools in Kentucky. They're looking at this in Atlanta, Georgia, right? And so these reforms, if it's up to the reformers, they would go forward with this. The only reason why it hasn't been able to expand the way that they want to is because there's been local opposition to this, led by teachers and others. And so I think that this is, on one hand, yes, there may be an opportunity here for a type of bringing folks together to kind of come up with solutions, but I see a much stronger thirst for a level of conversation and a vision of America that is going to require a battle, really. And so that vision of America, it's the schools, I think, provide the best way to examine it. And so I think that that's where the young people are right now, at least from the perspective that I see. Right.
So I actually, when I say problem solving, I don't mean people getting around a table and singing Kumbaya and finding common ground, and that's what schools will look like. I think that there is a real thirst for activism, but for having schools that look like what parents and kids and teachers really want. So there will be, but what has shifted is that has become the predominant, that theory of schooling being a community-based ecosystem, and something where kids are really engaged and we meet kids' needs, their social, emotional needs, as opposed to fixating on testing. That kind of vision of schooling as foundational to our democracy, small d and big D, that for the first time in a decade or two, that has become the predominant view of schooling. So I think I'm actually with you, on that the issue becomes then, how do we actually work to build confidence in cities and suburbs and rural areas that school is really the community, and that school really is a place where kids can actually learn what they need to learn to be prepared for life, for career, for the world, because schooling also has that role. And part of reckoning is part of that role is the reckoning. And so it becomes a complicated ecosystem, but I think we're seeing that shift to more of that sense of school as community, as opposed to, and that we have kind of wrested away school from the top-down folks who simply wanted to test kids, reduce kids to a number, or reduce teachers to an algorithm, and if it didn't work technocratically, then close them down or then open up a voucher. So I think or a charter. So I think we are in a very similar place on that. But I do think that the underlying message from the suburbs, from even kids who are hugely active, is they want things done. They do want to see mental health services in schools. They want guns out of schools. And there's a whole bunch of other activism that they really want, but that they don't feel shackled by being, they feel unshackled. They feel like the activism, the Teacher Spring, the activism from the Parkland and the Chicago kids, it has become contagious. So I think but the key, I still think, is that trust becomes trust versus frustration. and creating a sense that if you work hard and elect people who say they are with you and they get nothing done, then there is a frustration that the system doesn't work for them.
Yeah, if it's okay, let me respond to a few of the things that have been said. I think what I keep hearing feels like a caricature of what some of these reformers were trying to do. Now, I understand in politics, we do that, all right? But the election's over for now, so let's try to do a little more of the kumbaya stuff. And here's what I mean. The Michael Bloombergs. I'm in the middle. Look, the Michael Bloombergs and the Bill Gates and the Arnie Duncans and these other folks who have been out there, even the Michelle Rhees, I understand the argument you're trying to paint them as these sinister people. None of them ever wanted to reduce kids to a number or to a test score. Same with teachers. The urgency came from looking out at this huge, wonderful country we have with 50 million kids going through our schools and seeing that kids were going through 13 years of our education system, and a majority of them were coming out not ready to succeed in the next phase, right? We still have a situation where it's about 40% of kids come out just with the reading and math and writing skills to be successful in some kind of post-secondary education, not a 4-year degree, but even a technical training kinds of programs. So we have a system that is broken. And it's not because teachers aren't working hard enough or that everybody in the system isn't trying enough. It's that the system, we have this system, it's 100 years old or more. It's gotten creaky, and that there are some technical challenges and there are some political challenges to fixing it. I love that there's that energy you talk about from young people in Newark. I hope that somebody's helping them understand the history of urban school reform in places like Newark, that there have been waves of efforts of reform for almost ever, right? And that good people have come in saying we're going to fix the schools, and nothing ever seemed to get better. And it was, again, not for lack of trying, it was because the system itself was broken. Now, personally, I think part of what's broken about the system is that in some places in the old days, the school boards were largely elected by the teachers' unions. And so as a result, you had the unions negotiating with themselves around contracts, and you got some of these contracts that over time got bloated, that they did make it very hard to remove ineffective teachers from the classroom. It made it hard for any kind of changes. And so there was some energy to try to fix that, okay? Now, I also understand that the way that the system responded to many of the reforms, especially the top-down ones, but also competition from charter schools, was not the ways that any of us would want them to, right? We see people cheating, or we see the test prep, or we see, what we discovered, I think, is that the system had a lot less capacity in it than any of us imagined. That there were a lot of places where people didn't know what the better curriculum was, didn't know what the evidence-based practices were, weren't sure how to better organize themselves to get better results, okay? Meanwhile, we do see in a lot of big cities, including Newark, some very high-performing charter schools filled with educators that are just as progressive, if not more so, than all the people in this room, that are getting really good outcomes for kids, that have figured out how to make it engaging, that have brought in mental health services, that are doing social emotional learning, that are doing a lot of great stuff. And again, it's not because the people in them are any smarter than the people in the traditional public schools. It's just that they don't have to deal with this 100-year-old creaky, broken system. So, let's just remember that where the energy came from is in looking at the results that were not good. And in places where, in some cases like Newark, where there was a lot of spending and we still weren't getting the results that we needed. So now what? Talked about practice. Look, I think there are some potential for political grand bargains here. I do think there's energy in a lot of states to boost funding. This is the time to do it. You've got, the economy is hot, the states finally have money again. Not going to last forever, probably a year or two away from another recession at most. So this is the time to open the coffers. But here's the bargain. A lot of states still do a horrible job funding charter schools. Ohio, where we do a lot of work at Fordham, urban charter schools in Ohio get 60 cents on the dollar compared to traditional public schools. In our hometown of Dayton, they get 60% of the money. These charter schools serve basically 100% kids of color and kids coming in poverty. This is just as bad as the old days when we, and still in some states where we spend way more on affluent kids than we do on poor kids or white kids than kids of color. There's no excuse to spend, only 60 cents on the dollar for schools serving poor and minority kids in inner city Dayton. But that's what we're doing. So maybe the grand bargain is more money. We get in there, we fix, we look at the funding formulas, but part of the fix is that we got to fund charter schools fairly. Maybe we're not going to get to 100%, but sure, we can do better than 60%. Because otherwise, we're screwing over poor kids and kids of color. So those are the kind, so there are some potentials. One more idea. The energy, the Michelle Rhee energy was from this sense that there was a time back for a variety of reasons when we weren't paying teachers enough, when the system wasn't held accountable, where we let in a lot of people into teaching on emergency licenses and others that weren't very effective. And they were still teaching in our schools, and some of them weren't doing their job. Now, shame on the system for doing that. I understand that's a hard problem to fix. What is an easier problem to fix is to say for new teachers, we're going to make sure that every new teacher coming into our classroom is really well prepared and effective. And before they get tenure, to make sure that tenure approval process is serious, that they really demonstrate that they have what it takes to serve our children, right? And we also know that in most cities, that tenure approval process is still just a rubber stamp. New York City made a big change back in the Bloomberg days to make it meaningful, and my understanding, I think the UFT supported that change. And you still have a situation in New York where something like, I think, yeah, which was great. So here's my challenge: do it in every city. Why is New York City one of the only cities that does that? New York City, every year, something like 30%, I think, of teachers are denied tenure. They say you can come again next year and try again. But that seems about right. In most cities, it's it's about 1% of teachers, if any, are denied tenure. That is the kind of change that can build confidence in the system that we are going to actually figure out how to make sure these schools get better. And again, that's not something that I don't think is controversial. It's saying before somebody gets tenure, we're going to make sure that they're effective. Let's do that tomorrow.
No, I don't think. I think that the issues around the country are about how do we make sure that the teaching and learning conditions are such that kids thrive. It's a different conversation than we had 10 years ago. And the one piece I would just say to you, Mike, is this. I watched the Tony Thurmond case, the campaign. We were engaged in it. I watched Marshall Tuck use the same lies that Trump has done against Tony Thurmond. And I believe that the ends do not, the means do not justify the ends. And that at the end of the day, what we have seen, some of these folks who were supporting the DFER candidates don't lie about Tony Thurmond. Don't call him a pedophile. Don't say that he supports pedophiles. Don't say that he supports bad schools. And the kind of crap that we saw has to be called out in that kind of way. If we are indeed people who believe in truth, even if we fight things out here, as educators, we should actually not go down to that denominator of use anything that you want to win. That's what I am really, so for me, that piece of the election was not over when I saw that kind of crap at a good man who didn't have the money to actually fight against the money that was thrown at him.
And just to give people who may not have been watching that race very closely, this would be the California Superintendent of Public Instruction race between Tony Thurmond and Marshall Tuck, and eventually Thurmond prevailed. So,
Can I say something?
absolutely.
So I agree that there was by all folks involved through the 1980s and through the 1990s and 2008, where we see the Time magazine with cover with Michelle Rhee, that the schools needed to be better. I think that we all agree. I think everyone agreed that schools needed to be better. The solution, which is why I come back to the coming to the table for the solutions. The solution was the problem because it involved a racist view that the people who were running the schools, the black mayors, the black city council members, the black school board members, and in many cases Latinos as well, that they were the problem. And therefore, the solution required their separation from schooling decision making. And so that we haven't dealt with that. And so the idea that somehow separating community from decision making is going to improve schools is something that we really need to grapple with. And once we're able to deal with that, and this is the reason why it's so problematic, is because once we include all of those folks in the decision making and say, you run your schools like the suburbs get a chance to run their schools, other communities get to run their schools, then that means political power. And when you have political power in Chicago, when you have political power in Newark, when you have political power in New Orleans, now you have state political power, because these are major cities. And that's the issue that we haven't really dealt with and that we need to deal with. And so the grand bargain, I'm with the grand bargain. My vision of a grand bargain is for us to invest in developing black and Latino school teachers through the public schools, through their public schools and public universities. It doesn't have to be public universities, but I'm at a public university, so I'm for the public universities, and get them to be able to teach in public schools where they came from or wherever they want to go. I would hope that there's an energy for that. Reinvestment in young people through the public structure so that they could come and teach in the public schools. I mean, that's my vision of a grand bargain.
That's great. So I have a couple questions here that I'm going to try to combine because they all show a shared interest in the teacher spring and the walkouts and the question around full funding or increased funding for education. And the questions sort of go in two directions. Like, one is, what can we expect going forward? Like, this is a political movement that's more than nascent now. It's actually had anchoring and had some results. And then at the same time, we just went through midterms where we saw that in 5 states, voters actually voted down additional fundings for schools. So can you each talk a little bit about, we can myth bust then, yeah.
Yeah, look, first of all, on the teacher strikes, I mean, you would know better than I suspect we'll see more of this, but there are a limited number of states where you're going to see the same kind of action, because what we saw were states that had these single salary schedules, where really it was the teachers striking against the legislature. They were not striking against their local school districts because that's not where the decisions were being made. And there are a limited number of states where those kinds of salary decisions are being made at the state level. I think that the other stuff we know as Americans, we don't like to pay too much in taxes, and we like to get a lot in terms of benefits. That's why at the national level we have $1 trillion deficit. The states aren't allowed to run deficits. So, you run up against this very difficult issue, which is that, sure, poll people and they'll say they'd like to spend more on schools, but poll them and say, are you willing to pay more in taxes? Some people say yes, but often not everybody. So that's the challenge. I think,
You want to get rid of the Trump tax.
Yeah, I mean, and look, we're at a situation here where we have an aging society, where we are spending more and more money on Medicaid. It is difficult to imagine. I think there are some places like Kansas, Oklahoma, where the cuts were so draconian that you see the political pressure to come back. But I don't know that we're ever going to get back to the gravy days of the 90s, where there were these big increases that seem to go on every year, year after year, just because of demographic change. Now, the other demographic change we have is fewer kids, which is another huge shift that's happening. There was a great Hechinger article out right now about that. We've had this baby bust, and we have a dramatic decline in kids coming into schools. That's going to create all kinds of challenges. It also maybe means, if we figure out how to manage this, means we can spend more money per child. Anyways, I don't know if that made any sense. But, if you want to spend more money in the schools, you've got to make the case around increasing taxes. And we're still seeing in the suburbs that is a hard case to make.
I think the investment issues are going to be a cause of activism that brings a bunch of community activists together, including parents and locally elected officials and educators and kids over the course of the next year or two. I think that what the teacher spring showed was that local, if you look at Oklahoma, for example, Arizona and West Virginia, where they had longer than a day or two strikes, or walkouts, excuse my language, that local local school boards and superintendents were in support of what the educators were doing. In fact, West Virginia, basically the superintendents in all 55 counties closed their schools each and every day, and no one would actually put his or her name on the injunction to that the then Attorney General, the defeated senatorial candidate, Pat Morrissey, tried to do to reopen the schools. And it was, in some ways, if you actually look at what happened in Newark with kids, what happened, thank you, in Philadelphia with kids leading the charge, what you saw was kids and teachers in communities, rural communities, basically white rural communities, acting in the same exact way as Newark, as the community groups and kids acted in Newark. It was really, the resonance was pretty incredible over an issue of investment, making it really relevant so that the public saw it, and much to the dismay and chagrin of the governors in those states, who thought that they'd just wait out the school teachers. The public actually supported the school teachers because this was because they understood that this was key to the future of kids in those states. So I think that same underlying activism you may see as early as next week in Chicago. Chicago teachers are about to go on strike against the Acera charter network in Chicago. I think you're going to see it in LA in a month from now. But it is very much about not abstract, but about real issues, real demands. But it is the we and the community that is together actually going on doing these walkouts. And that's the activism that I think Domingo was talking about that I see all across the country.
But, what'll be interesting to see is if there are some places where the public sentiment turns. And we certainly see that behind, and I would keep an eye on Los Angeles. You do not have the same dynamic in terms of, in some of these states, the salary numbers are stark and striking, and there's a lot of sympathy. I'm not sure how sympathetic folks in Los Angeles are going to be given the wages in Los Angeles. And look, you're talking about depriving kids of time in school when they should be learning in a place where, the superintendent has come to the table, I think there's a sense that this is just a union that's been itching for a fight for a long time. So we'll see. I don't know. I just suspect if it goes on a long time, you're going to see public sentiment shift very quickly there.
But no one wants a strike. Let me be clear. I'm not suggesting that anybody wants a strike. No one wants a strike. But the issue in Los Angeles is about teaching and learning conditions. The issue and it's about the fact that special education, which should have been funded by the federal government to the tune of 40%, it has created huge issues structurally in the LA budget. And so teachers are being asked to do, more with less all the time. The class sizes, teachers are being asked to do more with less. So the issue, I know the superintendent is trying to make this about salaries. That is not what the LA teachers are talking about. They're talking about they want to have the conditions to teach so that kids will be successful.
Okay, as a reminder, #midtermed. Also, if you have a note card and you have a question, you can put those two things together and pass them up and I will try to get to your questions as well. This is actually a directive hidden in a question that I'm going to wrap in another question. With this excellent discussion on education, you have public school teachers in your audience. Why are we still not included in the discussions that affect us directly? Have these discussions, when most teachers can participate and have a say, include us? We have solutions. And I wanted to read that because I think it's really important, because I think that was also a principle that came to light during this election cycle. We heard from a number of educators who stepped up. AFT had 300 members who decided to run for office, and 60% were successful. But what we are seeing is that educators come forward with solutions, with ideas, with a knowledge and experience of working with all types, and that this is something really helpful in the political process. I did want to make the point that we very much wanted to have a public school teacher on the panel, and that Jahana Hayes would have joined us if her responsibilities as a newly elected member of Congress hadn't pulled her away. So we were mindful that that's an important voice to have at the table.
But I actually want to actually push back on whoever asked the question for the following reason. We are not doing our job as a union if public school teachers don't feel that they have a voice in this building. As someone who taught a decade or so ago, that is part of what we have to do as a union. And so if people feel like we are not, even when Jahana couldn't be here, what we have tried to do in terms of Shanker and other kinds of things is make sure that in what we're doing, that our members always see themselves reflected in what we are doing. So if that is a real issue for someone, I want you to come up and talk to me about it, because I want to make sure that we are doing the right things here. This is a union of practitioners, and we want to make sure that that practice and that emotion and that feeling is reflected in whatever leadership is up at the table talking on behalf of the members.
And if there's teachers out there that feel like their good ideas are being ignored by the administrators in their system, come talk about starting a charter school.
Moving on, I have a question here with respect to the upcoming higher ed reauthorization discussions. What momentum is there to make student loan servicing and forgiveness programs work to relieve hardships for teachers? What's the political work that needs to be done to make that happen?
Well, I'm not very optimistic that anything is going to be done about that for now, but I do think that this is one of those issues that's starting to gain momentum. While we've seen large movements at the K to 12, particularly with the high school students, I think that the higher ed movement is starting to gain momentum, and we'll see young people really fighting for some sort of, to address these student loan issues that they're currently undergoing. So I think that that's in the making as well.
So this is a huge fight. $1.5 trillion worth of debt. Students who had a right, virtually every single person who goes into public education, healthcare, or public services should be able to avail themselves of the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, a program that was passed under George W. Bush, pushed by Senator Kennedy. The first year that it should have been available was 2017, meaning that if somebody had 120 qualifying payments, the rest of their loan was to be extinguished if they were in these categories. 28,000 people applied in 2017, 96 people got it. That means that something is really wrong with the way in which the law is being implemented. Part of it is because of the loan servicers like Navient, who we at the AFT have just sued in an attempt to do a class action on behalf of not only members but people who are similarly situated, and the stories are heartbreaking. But it is more than that. It is why would the servicers have preference at the Department of Education as opposed to the borrowers? And then, again, on top of that, I'm going to go back to the investment issue. We tell students that college is absolutely imperative for their lives, but then we make it so prohibitively expensive, or pit adjuncts or graduate workers or faculty against tuition issues, so that or make the building of the stadium so important, as opposed to the kind of curriculum issues like in Stevens Lake, Wisconsin, where they have now cut all of the humanities. The Higher Ed Act is going to be a focus this year. I think Domingo's right, it's not going to go anywhere, but we have to make the case that students are more important than the servicers.
That's great. Sort of turning from higher ed to sort of looking at other state government again, back away from the federal government. So unprecedented amounts of money have been poured into local school board elections, and in many cases from outside donors, including DC. What are your thoughts on the changes this brings to local politics and the local schools, and where do we head to from there?
I have a couple of thoughts on that. I do think that's something that deserves a lot more attention from us, because on one hand, what we try to say is, we need local democracy. We need the reinsertion of community into the school decision-making process, and a way to kind of get away from that, circumvent that, is to have these elections that have all of this money that's pouring in from outside, and has influenced elections in LA, has influenced elections in other places. Certainly in Newark, we see the beginnings of that as well, because it's transitioning into an elected board now. So, think that the only solution is more involvement, more politics, more AFT energy behind what's happening, because the alternative to that would be some sort of anti-democratic process, which we already tried a long time. So the solution really is more democracy, more involvement, and more energy. That would be my take on this.
I guess I challenge about why that is a solution. Let's be honest about this. Let's say we're talking about Mike Bloomberg. Okay, now with Mike Bloomberg, I bet a lot of people in this room agree with him when it comes to gun control, right? He has been bankrolling big national organizations and a lot of political campaigns to try to fight the NRA and to try to make progress when it comes to gun safety. And on that, you probably say, hooray, okay? Now, he also looks out and he cares about improving public education, and he worries that there's a lot of these big city school systems that, as I explained earlier, are not making the kind of progress we'd like to see. And in some kinds, it appears it's because there are school boards that are blocking any kind of significant changes. So he says, all right, then we're going to write some checks, and we're going to try to get some reform-minded people to run for those school boards. So, again, you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. This is right. We're now, all right, let's fight it out in the public, in the democratic means. Now, we've also seen in California, the money only goes so far, right? So, Marshall Tuck had a ton of money. And he didn't win. So, money is a factor, but it's not everything. So let's just, again, remember the reason that some of these people are writing these checks is because they've gone and seen with their own eyes that there are some of these, especially high-performing public charter schools that are really getting amazing results for kids. And they look at this traditional school system, and they're just not seeing the same kind of movement there. And they just can't understand, if we care about poor kids, why are we trying to kill the charter schools and defend the traditional public schools and the system as it is? So, I'd much rather those billionaires write those checks to try to improve public education than just buy themselves a yacht. I guess Betsy DeVos has like 10 of those, right? So, and by the way, I've never gotten invited to go on a single one, and I'm mad about that. But anyways, I digress. But keep in mind, before the billionaires started writing those checks, frankly, the unions, you guys had all the power, you had all the political money, that you were able to support candidates. Most, big city school board elections it was people supported by the unions that won, oftentimes in low voter turnout elections where you got 9% of the people voting, half of whom were teachers and the other half were their relatives. I mean, this is, an attempt to try to even the playing field.
So I would actually argue we should have campaign finance everywhere and level the playing field, because at the end of the day, I would take people power over money any day of the week and try to create that kind of engagement. I think there's too much money in politics. I've always thought there's too much money in politics. I think it's ridiculous that we are already talking about we're still November 2018, and there's a fixation on 2020 already. The millions or billions of dollars that are going to be spent could be spent on all sorts of different things. So engagement of people is more important. I want to just debunk a couple of things. Number one, our political money is basically individual members basically making COPE contributions and then it all getting together as one big amount. But it is the concept, with one big exception from the NRA, we actually try to tell the truth. And we actually don't try to value guns over kids. We actually value kids over guns. And, and at the end of the day, somebody could argue that, somebody can make an argument that due process is or isn't important or things like that. But at the end of the day, every single person who we represent actually is trying to make a difference in the lives of somebody else. And it is voluntary money that people put together and array together in the kind of sense of we are stronger together, and regular people can do things together which they can't do alone. Having said that, I actually want to make a point which I think will completely surprise you, Mike, which is that in the aftermath of all of the memes about George Soros and Michael Bloomberg and Tom Steyer and what happened in Pittsburgh, I have actually stopped using the term billionaires. I think that the Koch network, the DeVos family, they are in a very different kind of place than, even though I may disagree with what Bloomberg did in terms of education. I want to be very careful that we are not in the midst of inadvertently moving forward any of these kind of anti-Semitic memes. So I've been very careful not to use that terminology anymore. And I do think we should the fight to get money out of politics and to basically actually get truth back into politics. Yes, still believing as fervently as I do about the First Amendment, but we have to really focus on the power of the press and make sure that press has the kind of latitude that they need and actually really get engagement of people into, as Domingo said, into this political space.
And if I could just add something to that, and there's things that we can do about this, right? And so the first thing is, my take on this is that we should try to move away as much as possible from the reliance on the Bloombergs, whether he's on the right side on this issue for me, on that side. So to get away from that and more to what Randy's saying about, kind of like the people power, getting people to be engaged, right? And there's things that we can do about this. These reforms, they organized elections in a way to purposely lead to low participation. So why not have school board elections at the same time that we have a midterm election, or the presidential election, right? Just get as many people as possible involved in this. So I think that we're all in agreement that the solution to this is more democracy and more participation from all stakeholders, right? All citizens, and I think we'll all be better for that.
You guys, all right, this is an audience that wants us to spice things up a little bit. So no, wait till you hear this. Okay, so they say, who were the credible leaders of the school reform movement in the Trump and post-Trump era? Could be in politics, school systems, ed policy circles. Could Mike name some promising left-leaning candidates, and can Randy name a few on the right?
Yeah, interesting. Sure. All right, so let's talk about. I mentioned Jared Polis already. Founder of a charter school, but progressive, no doubt about it, on many, many issues. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens out there in Colorado. I think he's trying to find a way to bring together the DFER types, but also the traditional education groups. And I hope he succeeds. So there's one. Another one in Colorado is somebody else who ran in the primary, which is Mike Johnston. He's this other great up-and-comer, former Teach for America teacher, very inspirational story. Again, ran a couple of charter schools and then became a state representative, or state senator maybe. And I think we'll be hearing more from him going forward. Who else? Michael Bloomberg's on the left, maybe not left enough for many of you in this room, but he's certainly still actively engaged. Andrew Cuomo's not my cup of tea, but I know he's been strong in a lot of these education issues. Who else? I think.
Can I suggest someone that you might be
Please,
interested in?
yeah. No, please.
I think somebody that's really I would have thought would have been one of the first people you mentioned is Cory Booker.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
Right?
That's fair.
And Cory Booker it'd be really
Yes.
interesting. He's
Yes.
trying to go left, but he has a record.
That's right. That's
And
exactly. That's
so-
right. Yes.
We'll
Yes.
see.
Yes, I would put him up there as well. Maybe a Deval Patrick as well. I just feel, some of these names are not exactly new necessarily. They've been around a while in some cases, but sure, yeah, a Cory Booker, yeah. Okay, Randy, over to you.
So, we used to have a situation where business leaders and civic leaders, where public education was pretty bipartisan, and that you'd have business leaders, you'd have civic leaders, kind of all would get together, understanding completely that the democracy issues that Domingo has raised and the voice of the people and the voice of communities had to be center stage. Those big conversations have gone bye-bye. But people like Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, who were very much engaged in the Bush administration, in a different, and I think those are people that you could actually engage in a conversation about about how you create broad-based opportunity in the United States of America, both economically and educationally. There's been we had actually a really interesting, I don't know if Chris Runge is in the room, but there was in the National Committee on State, or Commission on State Legislators, there was a group of 6 Democratic legislators and 6 Republican legislators, one of which was from Indiana, who is normally viewed as a big voucher and charter advocate, and one of whom was from Wisconsin, who actually was one of the votes for Act 10. And they and their Democratic colleagues actually got together and put together a pretty incredible paper about basing it on what the OECD had done and others had done about a path forward. And I suspect that if Hillary Clinton had been elected, that would have been center stage. Once Trump was elected, there was no kind of appetite for, in a Pence White House. And Pence, let's make no mistake about it, Pence has a lot of control over the domestic policies that Trump doesn't care about in terms of this, of this White House. But there was, when you listen to both these Democrats and Republicans talking, and really going to where the evidence led them, and where practice led them, and where good strategy led them, it was pretty eye-opening in terms of seeing that there could be, and I really do hate the word common ground, because as important as it feels to me, it feels to others that it is compromise as opposed to a path forward. But they really came together on a bunch of different strategies that were funded in terms of a path forward for public education.
That's great, thank you. This one is a little bit of a giveaway to Mike, but since I know that each of you have worked with governors and looked closely and thinking about the sort of promise and potential in this new moment, I wonder if you could each take a minute and make some recommendations, give some advice to newly elected or re-elected governors out there about what they can do to play a transformative role or be a positive push right now in education.
Yeah, I think transformative is too much to ask, and I don't think there's appetite for that. We've had maybe too much of governors trying to be transformative. But look, some of the things I've said, grand bargain on funding, that includes public charter schools in the picture. That's important in a lot of states. But also, look, we still got work to do on equity and just getting the numbers back up to where they were before the recession. Where there's energy is clearly around career and technical education, that governors want to run as the workforce governor, and that makes sense from a lot of reasons and political reasons too. There's a lot of angst out there about the Trump voters that we all started thinking about more, I think, in 2016, and places, geographies, especially rural America, small town America, where the jobs had left, and there's questions about economic viability, and a renewed interest in trying to figure out, is there an education solution here to help young people have a promising future, especially young people that are not planning to or don't have an interest in going through a 4-year degree kind of program. So, I think there's a lot of reasons why you see that renewed interest in career tech. And I think that's mostly good. But the problem is we got to actually get it right. And I think we've seen more rhetoric about it than we've seen really promising policies. We want to make sure it's high quality. We certainly don't want to go back to the old days, the horrible old days of racist and classist tracking. So how do we get this right? How do we make it so that in high school, young people, if they want to, can be working on a post-secondary track that's more technical in nature, but that's really, going to lead them to get a credential that's going to be valuable in the workplace, that has great, workplace learning, all that kind of stuff. It is hard. I mean, this is going to take some hard, technocratic work to get right. And those are things that, if governors engage on, I think they could do some good.
So I do think that a conversation about increasing funding is important. However, I would say that should be dedicated to a more robust public education system of education. The one thing that I think governors, and this goes back to a question that was asked about higher education, I think governors have the opportunity to think creatively about how to deal with this student loan problem that we have in the United States. And so what I would encourage governors to do is, use our federalist form of governance to try to think about alternatives or solutions, policy solutions to this problem that can be hopefully replicated across states. And so I don't have that solution in mind, but I do think that governors have the power and if they can think about creative, imaginary ways to deal with this in their states, so that the young people in the states can stay in their states and it could be, part of the growing middle class in their states. Try to deal with the solution so they can be replicated across states. So that's what I would suggest, advise governors to think about.
People want voice and agency, and they want a path to a better life. And that's why education, both higher education and pre-K-12, have always been kind of a beacon of hope for people. And so governors have to actually think about how they help make their states places where the strivers and the strugglers can actually have a home and can actually climb that ladder of opportunity and can have their piece of the American dream in a safe, welcoming way. And so I would actually say community schools, community schools, community schools, community schools, community schools, creating kind of wraparound, not only wraparound services, but a sense of school as community, that where parents and kids and educators and civic leaders and others see the school as center to a community. And that's something we have a bunch of different models about, but that is something that's important. I also think that the whole student debt and how we fund higher education is absolutely essential, and I agree. It's really interesting to me that DeVos is trying to use preemption to stop the states from doing this at the very same time as it's normally a conservative ideology to allow states to be incubators, but also from early childhood, thinking about how to do that, thinking about childcare, to career tech ed, not just in high school, but how we actually retrofit and think about Lordstown right now, think about Hamtramck right now, think about Baltimore right now. You have 3 communities right now after the GM announcement yesterday whose lives and trajectories have completely been changed. And frankly, if those announcements in Ohio had been made a week before the election, there would probably be a very different gubernatorial result than after the election. So schools become really important centers of community, and governors should be engaging with their locally elected officials and communities in how to actually make that the center of pluralism in America.
Thank you so much. As we close, I want to give each of you a chance to sort of give summation remarks, but I want to put in Randy. Sorry. I want to give people a chance to say some final remarks. And so Randy has to leave. Do you want to say a quick word as you walk out?
I just want to say thank you. And and thank you to both Mike, and thank you Domingo and Mike, and thank you to all of you for being here. This is the start. These conversations are supposed to be that. Real conversations with real questions, really pressing us to actually think in a value-based way. But at the end of the day, democracy starts with engagement. And so I just want to say thank you very much to both of you. Thank you. And to Michelle, thank you for moderating.
Thanks, Randy. And as we let you make your exit, I'm going to throw the question to both Mike and Domingo, but I'm going to put a little bit of a frame on it. I'm really interested to hear about something that impacted you during the midterms. It could have terrified you or really alarmed you, or hopefully it inspired you or really gave you some hope, but something you saw that has stuck with you. And then also, as you look forward to what lies ahead, like what is your sort of greatest aspiration in this moment? What do you think would have made the midterms like most meaningful if we could take on and succeed next?
Well, I'll go back to where I started, right? That this is in many ways a historic election. We got more people vote in this midterm election than we've ever had, and to support that, the kind of theme that has been going on in this conversation, and I've been really emphasizing the young people and the teachers, that they are energized and they are participating in ways that we haven't seen before. And so that gives me a lot of promise, really, about what the future looks like. And what I do think that is going to be a bumpy ride. And I don't think it's a bad thing that we're going to have a bumpy ride. I think it's really a competition about what we want America to look like, and these young people are not having it. They have a vision for America that's more inclusive, that is committed to the kind of things that they consider important, and there's going to be an opposition to that. There is an opposition to that, and so it's going to be bumpy. But I do think that there is a lot to be I'm struggling with the word because the word that comes to my mouth is hopeful, and so I just don't want to use the word hopeful. But there's a lot to look forward to in terms of looking at what the young people are doing and what they're excited about. And so, yeah, I ended with that.
So I guess a couple of thoughts. One is I was encouraged by Maryland and Massachusetts, this fascinating thing where these 2 Republican governors won overwhelmingly in these very blue states, in part because the voters were happy that they were working on getting things done and working across the aisle. And this feels very old-fashioned now to think about a kind of politics that's about solutions and working together. But it gives me some hope that maybe we could get back to that at the national level someday too. And I think just some of the data coming out of the election, there's been so much narrative on the divide, and it's real. But that I saw some data, for example, on the president's scaremongering about the caravan. and how, yes, that drove up some of his numbers among some of his base. But there's actually some evidence, first of all, that he overwhelmingly lost independents on that issue. And that we've seen that not only did he lose in the suburbs, but he did lose among some of the white working class as well. That there was movement away from the president's scaremongering, especially on that immigration issue, in a way that makes me feel optimistic that the country is rejecting that form of politics going forward.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I want to thank you for your participation this entire panel, being willing to come here, and you've really both added really thoughtful, serious comments to, I think, what we're all wrestling with, which is how do we now take this moment, which is significantly a better moment than where we stood 2 months ago, but then how do we truly make it meaningful to the students, to the educators, to the families, to the community members who all, by all accounts in the research and data I've been looking at, put more into these midterms than any midterms prior, right? Like, we have a more active and engaged citizenry than we've been able to boast in a very long time. And now I think it's incumbent upon all of us, particularly those who work in fields that reach out and touch communities and students and schools, to think about how we use this very powerful network and resource, and also our role as being trusted messengers to keep people inspired and engaged and help give them the tools so that they are carving the path forward. So I want to thank you for the work that each of you do on this every single day. I'd like to thank all of you for making the time to be part of this conversation. And with that, again, #MidtermEd. And thank you.